This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored in part by World Relief, the humanitarian organization that we trust to tackle some of the world's biggest problems. Do you want to fight back against suffering and injustice, but find yourself wondering, can I really make a difference? The answer is simple. Yes, you can. Together with listeners like you, World Relief is responding to millions affected by conflict, mass displacement, food insecurity, and so much more. Now through June 30th, when you join The Path as a monthly partner in World Relief's work across the globe, your monthly gifts can be doubled for the first year up to $55,000. Check out worldrelief.org/holypost for more on how you can multiply the impact of your recurring giving. Your yes matters. Don't miss this opportunity. Head over to worldrelief.org/holypost and join The Path today.
Welcome to the Holy Post. Bud Light, Target, Kohls, Chick-Fil-A, the list of companies and brands being boycotted by Christians keeps getting longer. Now there are even calls to boycott the hit streaming series about Jesus, The Chosen. When are boycotts justified? When are they just performative? And is there any escape from this purity death spiral they create? Then I talked to Pastor Brenda Quinn and author Richard Foster about his new book, Learning Humility. When did Christians decide humility was a vice rather than a virtue? And what are the essential ingredients to cultivate it in our lives and communities? All of that, plus Atheist Street Pirates. And exclusively for our Holy Post Plus subscribers this week, we have a new episode of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess about prophets. What the Bible actually says about them is even stranger than you think. And of course, with Holy Post Plus, you get ad-free episodes of the regular show, access to live streams with me and Phil, special merchandise, the Holy Post Book Club, and a lot more. So go to holypost.com to learn all about it. Okay, here's episode 568.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I'm here with Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
And Skye.
Hi, Phil.
Just Skye?
An exciting middle name. No, I was thinking Skye, the brawler. Skye, the theological wonderkind. I don't know. You need a nickname. You need a moniker.
When I was on staff at the church, my nickname was the Velvet Fist.
Oh, yes.
What does that mean?
Skye, the Velvet Fist Jatani. Bring it. Would you like to unpack that a little bit for our audience?
I gained a reputation for being able to say difficult things in a way that people could receive it.
Oh, that's a very useful skill.
So, and I early on, I was the one they sent in to any ministry or team that we were shutting down to break the bad news. Yeah.
Huh.
So. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
That might tell us a little bit about the character and sensitivities of your former senior pastor.
I don't know what it says, but I think
Skye will tell
the fact that they chose me is interesting. Yeah. But
Skye will tell the orphans we're pulling the plug. Go, Skye, go. Sorry, orphans. And now it's time for the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin.
As if we didn't have enough to worry about. Caitlin and Skye. Skye, the Velvet Fist. So, he punched me, but it was kind of fuzzy. So I liked it. It was just a little bit fuzzy. Atheist street pirates are coming for our religious signs.
What?
Street pirates. I've heard of porch pirates.
I'm trying to process each of those words together.
LA's atheist street pirates go national in efforts to remove illegal religious signs. In fact, so here's the deal, Caitlin. Have you ever seen a Jesus Saves sign on public space, like it's tacked to a telephone
not like
pole
a billboard, but like just someone stuck one
not
there.
Like a billboard,
okay,
no.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
not like a billboard, because buying a billboard is legal.
That's good.
But just sticking a sign on a public item, a mailbox, is technically not legal. So It started as a small group of atheists tracking and removing religious signs from public streets in Los Angeles. Now the network spans more than a handful of states, with volunteers documenting and taking down illegally placed religious material on utility poles and overpasses across the country, known as the Atheist Street Pirates. That's actually their chosen moniker.
That's a terrible name.
Atheist Street Pirates.
Because pirates are criminals who steal things, and they're more like vigilantes who are trying to enforce the law outside normal
Also, pirates
channels.
sounds way cooler than taking signs down.
Yeah, pirates is cool. Well, it makes you feel way cooler when you're just taking a sign.
I have a question.
The group formed.
Do you have to be an atheist? Are they all atheists?
You have to be an atheist.
You have to be an atheist
you can't
to join.
Do it. I don't know. It doesn't. But that's the name.
I guess you wouldn't want to join if you didn't.
So
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think they should be secular street vigilantes.
You want to help their rebrand.
Secular street sign removers.
Oh, that was worse.
Yeah. That sounds incredibly boring. Who would want to be a secular street sign remover?
It's not like what they're doing is actually exciting.
They got to spice it up.
If you call yourself a pirate while you're doing it, it becomes exciting. Anything that you do while referring to yourself as a pirate is
This
exciting.
is starting to feel actually very Christian, like very evangelical, to be like, let's give it a really jazzy name to make ourselves feel like we're warriors or pirates or...
Yes. Yes. In fact, the Atheist Street Pirates recently had an art exhibition in L.A. featuring signs and banners they'd removed all across Southern California.
Wait a minute, though. If they're having an exhibition, isn't that promoting the very messages they're trying to...
Come see these religious messages.
That is very weird.
And are you having an art exhibition with stolen art? Because it wasn't yours.
But it was posted in a place it shouldn't be.
Yeah, it was discarded,
so
kind of.
It's not...
it's
not like they're going into private homes.
I know.
That would be more piratey.
That would make them actual pirates. Exactly.
And they should only take signs that they can reach by boat.
Right.
So they can row up and then take it. Arrgh, and fly a little flag. Arrgh, Atheist Street Pirate flag. Arrgh. Or they could put a boat on wheels, and they just need to be in a boat-shaped
Skye's into it now.
Of some kind.
No. I've got a conspiracy theory already.
Yeah.
The acronym of Atheist Street Pirates is ASP, which is a name for a snake, which is a symbol of the devil, which means these are satanic people.
Wow.
There you go. And there's your conspiracy theory.
And what's the acronym for Atheist Street Sign Removers?
Secular Street Sign Removers. That also sounds demonic.
Yeah, it's a hiss.
Okay. What's our judgment on the Atheist Street Pirates? Or do we, and what does it say about America? Let's bring it to a bigger picture. What does it say about America when God-fearing citizens can't even illegally put up their own signs?
I feel like they're a mirror of the thing they're protesting. It's like, this is sort of meaningless, me sticking this thing up here, but I feel good doing it. Taking it down is pretty meaningless too, but I feel very like I'm performing some public service doing it.
Okay. Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, I think both sides of this equation is kind of virtue signaling or virtue signing, I guess, in this case.
It's competing futility.
That's a good...
Right.
You're doing something that doesn't do anything.
Which is a pretty good
I.
description of American politics and culture right now.
Competing futility.
Okay, that's good. That's real good. Okay. The Boycott Wars are
competing
heating up.
futility.
Yes.
There you go.
Yes. In the name of competing utility, the boycott wars are hotter than shimmying halfway up a street pole in L.A. on a summer day to pull down a Jesus Saves sign. That's how hot did you follow that,
that
Caitlin?
was vivid description.
Caitlin, that was a callback to the prior
that was
story.
good.
Thank you. So it started out, this is stuff that happened in the last week, and this is interesting. started out earlier, not last week, but earlier with Bud Light. We talked about that before. Bud Light got into trouble. And then Target got in trouble, big trouble, because they, for Pride Month, had some transgender merchandise, and people got very unhappy and are boycotting Target. And then Kohls, somebody walked into Kohls and discovered that they were selling a onesie with a pride flag on it. So they said, uh-oh, gotta boycott Kohls now. There's a pride flag on a onesie. And then, because they're all trying to, trying to distort our children. They're trying to corrupt our children by putting onesies on babies with rainbow flags. And then something happened with Chick-fil-A. Do you know what happened with Chick-fil-A last week? Okay. Someone discovered that Chick-fil-A has a VP of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is like CRT. That's like the new CRT is DEI. 3 letters that tell us everything we need to know, which is that you're on the wrong team. So Chick-fil-A, as Mike Naraki refers to it, Christian chicken with a pickle, Chick-fil-A, the only food company that we can trust, besides Tyson's is also, I think, very Christian-owned. Oh. But Chick-fil-A, the only restaurant we can truly trust as being Christian, except Cracker Barrel. Okay. Chick-fil-A, okay, and In-N-Out. Chick-fil-A, one of the only 3 restaurants that we Christians can trust that are on our side, is celebrating and promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that goes against the Bible, which is against diversity, equity, and inclusion. So now we have to boycott Chick-fil-A. That happened last week. And then also last week, The Chosen Season 4 put out a new promo. The new promo is like a 6-minute behind the scenes. We're shooting. Get excited, everybody. More Jesus is headed your way. Here's which part of the Bible we cover in this season. And someone noticed, in fact, a guy named, I have his name, a guy named Root, but not Jerry Root from Wheaton College, a different Root. Hang on. I have it. John Root, who is a Turning Point USA contributor. Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk's young conservative Wonder League. Noticed on the set, on the side, on a camera, was a very small pride flag. And he took a screenshot of it and demanded that the producers of the show explain why there would be a pride flag on the set. Not like where you would see it in the show, but like one of the crew members had brought it.
That would be kind of strange.
That would be kind of strange. And demanded they explain why it was there. And Dallas Jenkins responded and said, just like with
who's the creator?
Yes, the creator of the show. Okay, so the Turning Point USA contributor John Root asked The Chosen to explain the presence of the pride flag on set. An official social media account said on Tuesday that the initiative uses the work of those who have varying beliefs, the initiative being The Chosen, uses the work of those who have varying beliefs about Jesus, but insisted that the project would still be able to accurately honor his life and ministry, just like with our hundreds of cast and crew who have different beliefs or no belief at all. We will work with anyone on our show who helps us portray or honor the authentic Jesus. We ask that audiences let the show speak for itself and focus on the message, not the messenger, because we will always let you down. But John Root was not satisfied. John Root was not satisfied. And he responded and said, shouldn't every part of this show be biblically based to truly honor the authentic Jesus, including the camera? He didn't say that. I'm saying it. If you stand by having a pride flag on your set, you are not a Christian show. You are not a Christian show. You are a production that happens to be about Jesus while catering to the sin of this fallen world. Okay.
I find this so Ironic.
So the Daily Wire picked it up. The Daily Wire, which is a huge, massive conservative news organization, picked it up, ran an article explaining it and also criticizing other things about the show, like some of its theology. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the Daily Wire is not a Christian news outlet, but they will critique Christians' theology, assuming that there's the right way you're supposed to do it, which tends to be kind of a Southern fundamentalist way to do it. And then there's a wrong way to do it, which is anyone that's not doing it in a kind of a Southern fundamentalist way. So they took the show to task and said this was, ridiculous. You shouldn't have a pride flag. Then it gets really interesting. So then people started calling for a boycott of The Chosen last week. We can't watch The Chosen anymore. It's an evil show. It's not a Christian show. Then, gets even better. The co-CEO of The Chosen, the co-CEO of the Daily Wire, the ironically named Jeremy Boring, who's actually not boring. He's a screenwriter and an actor. And he's
it's unfortunate.
Very lively. But anyways, his name is Jeremy Boring. He tweeted about the article that his news organization put out and said, "This is a disgusting piece, and I'm sorry we ran it."
But they didn't remove it.
I don't know. I haven't checked to see if it's still there.
I don't think they've removed it.
And he went on to defend it. He said, "A show like The Chosen has 100 plus employees. One of them brought a pride flag to work. That sucks, but it's hardly the fault of the show. The producer's response also sucks, but it isn't untrue. There is no, you don't have to hire gay people if you don't agree with homosexuality allowance in U.S. labor law. On the whole, this piece, the one that my company wrote, reeks of purity death spiral politics. Unless you are perfect, as defined by the ever and rapidly changing sensibilities of the moment, you aren't even good." Then he says, "That way lies madness. Hold people and organizations accountable, yes. Hold them to impossible standards and require death for their sins. I think actual Jesus had something to say about that."
Jesus.
But isn't that sort of the Daily Wire's whole MO? Is to hold everyone to an unrealistic standard of cultural and political purity?
Kind of, maybe, kind of. So now people are calling for the boycott of the Daily Wire because the CEO sided with The Chosen over the mob, the anti-pride mob.
Okay, there are so many layers to this onion. So many layers. Where do you want to go first, Phil?
Caitlin wants to jump in and just give me your first reaction to all of that.
Okay, well, my first reaction, I think, is just a comment generally on the kind of impulse to boycott things, which some boycotts can be good. I mean, there have been examples in the past that were really oriented towards justice. I think, though, the fact that that's so quickly where we go with everything, like we'll boycott this thing because they did one thing I didn't like. I think the language that the CEO uses is actually really good. The death spiral, purity death spiral. Purity death spiral. I really think the more that I've watched people talk about the boycotts online, especially I'm thinking and it is a lot of times women who do more shopping, especially for talking about the Kohls or the Target boycott, talking on Instagram, talking about on Twitter about the boycotts. It does seem like very often it's an example of the way our politics has turned into identity. It's just about kind of, let me show you what community I belong to and that I believe the right things. And I have to maintain a level of purity. I can't associate with anything that I disagree with or that I think is wrong or evil. And it really is actually, I think, not that all boycotts do this, but this impulse to so quickly move to the boycott method is to me it's not actually doing the work of politics. It's actually avoiding the work of politics. It's saying, instead of engaging in difficult conversations where I'm clear about what I believe and I'm watching it confront what other people believe that is different, we're working through our differences, we're showing why this matters so much to me, but I'm acknowledging what matters so much to you, and we're working out compromise through very difficult, deeply held beliefs. Instead, it says, I'm just removing myself from this thing that I think is wrong. And we're not going to get anywhere if that's the kind of method that we're always going to. If the impulse is just, let me make my world smaller and smaller, so it's just me and my closest family and they don't touch anything that I think is wrong or bad, it's not actually building a community together where we're working through those differences. These questions about sexuality in particular that animate so many of these boycotts, and questions about race and justice and fairness that are animating the Chick-fil-A boycott, are important communal questions for us to work through. If you think you're engaging politically, if you think you're doing something because you're just refusing to participate in this or you're refusing to buy something, you're actually bypassing the important conversations that we need to have where we work out our differences with our real neighbors.
Okay, Kaylin, have you ever heard of anyone on the progressive side of the spectrum saying, we need to boycott Nike because of their labor practices in Thailand?
I mean, I've heard some people.
Different?
The funny thing is the Chick-fil-A one has
Different?
an exact parallel. It's like people have been boycotting Chick-fil-A for a long time and sometimes because of an inflated sense of how much money is actually going from Chick-fil-A to causes they think are wrong. But I think the impulse can 100% exist on both sides. And I do think in a variety of ways, not just both sides, but in a variety of different issues. I think sometimes boycotts can totally be justified. I'm thinking of like civil rights era when, especially in communities that were deeply segregated, Black people chose to not buy from any of the businesses in the white side of town to say, if you're not going to treat us well, that's a good example of it. But I think the problem now is not just that there's boycotts that happen, it's that that's our impulse is to say, I'm actually removing myself from this important conversation. And I think I've done something by not shopping at Target, which maybe, as you pointed out, Phil, like maybe people should be rethinking their practices, not just because Target has a, pride display, but because most of the things that you can buy in a lot of those stores come from really bad practices of mistreating people and getting kind of cheap fashion. So there could be good reasons to not participate in that, but it's a lot more complicated than just saying, I'm going to post an Instagram about how I'm not going to Target so that I'm on the right side of this debate.
There's a flip side. There's boycotts, but there's also boycotts, which means this is the other side of the Chick-fil-A thing. When a lot of progressive people were boycotting Chick-fil-A, a bunch of conservative people said, we're going to go to Chick-fil-A intentionally to support what they're doing. So there's boycotting and boycotting. What I think is really interesting is when a brand actually flips from being identified with one side to the other. Mm-hmm. And the most interesting of that might be Tesla, where originally Tesla was a very popular brand among progressives because it was seen as a way of supporting environmental concerns by having a zero emissions car. But since Elon Musk has become increasingly outspoken on the right side of the political spectrum and pro-Trump and other things, progressives are having a harder time buying Teslas because they feel like they're supporting a political agenda they don't like. And now Tesla is associated more as a MAGA red brand. And so it's switching its allegiance. But this whole idea that consumer brands now have to represent my identity and my political identity or my religious identity is a fascinating development. I mean, in a consumer society, we all project our identity through the brands that we consume and display. But now, because so many people's identities are primarily rooted in politics, we want all of these consumer brands to also pick a side so we know which brands to display that align with our politics. And it's a whole new world where every brand is having to pick a side. And that's not good for America. And it's not good for these brands either.
Well, there's also an angle I wanted to bring up, that when you look at a new evolving right-wing media universe, there's a new ecosystem of entities that are working together, and I'll list Daily Wire, Prager University, and the Babylon Bee as three prime examples where Daily Wire now owns Prager University. They're so closely aligned that they bought it. And they collaborate with the Babylon Bee on things, in that it's politically conservative, but with a gloss of Southern Christianity kind of across the top. So there's a very interesting, maybe it's a product, maybe it's just a natural outcome of the religious right, that, the religious right, Fox catered to the religious right, but didn't become the religious right. But now we're seeing, you go to the Daily Wire website and you can take a class from Jordan Peterson on the book of Exodus. Like, what the heck is that? He wasn't even a Christian until a minute ago, and now he's teaching me the book of Exodus on what was a secular news site. So, and the clash with the CEO of the Daily Wire with his own readers is really interesting, because the Daily Wire was founded in Southern California by a screenwriter, a failed screenwriter, Jeremy Boring, and a Jewish political commentator, Ben Shapiro. And they became friends and were lamenting the state of, everything, and decided to start something together. So it was founded in Southern California by a Christian screenwriter from Texas originally and a Jewish political commentator. They found success attacking the left. They decided they didn't like California anymore, so they moved to Tennessee. And so now their massive growth has happened not by hiring Southern Californians, but by hiring people in the Bible Belt. And I'm just wondering if this conflict that we just saw this week is a little bit of the Southern California founder saying, wait, when did we become so pharisaical, so puritanical? It's like, well, look where you live now and look at who you're hiring. So you really have changed the tenor of the company from, owning the libs to owning the wrong kind of Christians.
Okay, that takes us back to the chosen thing, and I said how ironic this was, and it really is, because here, the Gospels as they're depicted in this TV series feature religious leaders criticizing Jesus all the time and his followers because they're not following the prescribed purity of the religious leaders. Why do your disciples eat with tax collectors and sinners, and why don't they fast and all that? They're constantly criticizing Jesus for not maintaining the righteousness that they think he should maintain. And then you get somebody who's apparently a fan of The Chosen criticizing The Chosen because one of the people they've hired to help produce that show, a cameraman, I assume, has put a small little pride flag, which in their view, here it is, this writer for the Daily Wire is behaving exactly like the religious leaders that are the villains in the very story that he's trying to promote. It's like no one sees the irony of this.
Nope.
It's just ridiculous.
Nope, Skye. No one sees the irony.
One other thing. And this I'm kind of flipping sides here a little bit, is I agree with what Jerry Jenkins said in defense. Like, hey, we're a commercial podcast.
I was like, whoa, we're going a different place.
Jerry's his dad. Sorry. Dallas. Sorry. They're a commercial
if you don't know out there, the dad, Jerry Jenkins, wrote the Left Behind books. The son, Dallas Jenkins, made The Chosen.
Right.
It's an interesting family.
Okay. So he's correct. Like, they can't just discriminate based on ideology or sexual identity or any of that kind of stuff when they're hiring production workers, stuff like that. But they could have decided to create this project as a nonprofit Christian ministry, in which case they would have been able to have a faith-based test for who they hire, from actors all the way through for production. But they chose not to do it as a nonprofit Christian ministry. They chose to do it as a commercial enterprise. So for those who are really upset that they have employees that maybe are not Christian or maybe hold to values or beliefs that they don't agree with, there was a way out of that. They chose not to go. I don't think what they're doing is wrong at all, but there is, I guess, a foothold for criticism there if people want to make.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know. I don't think Dallas wanted to go that way. I know Dallas, and
I know,
he's a little bit edgy. He's just a little bit edgy. He's not as conservative as his father, just a little bit edgy. And I would say, that he wanted it to be not just for Christians to work at on purpose. And he likes it that way.
I agree with his decision. I agree with his decision. I'm not criticizing it. But for some people who want to believe that everything they participate in is 100% pure, biblical, conservative, whatever their purity test is, you basically have to extricate yourself from the entire economy, including the Christian economy, in order to do that.
Okay.
There's no way around it.
Oh, Caitlin, you had something to say.
I think there's a closer relationship here between the part about The Chosen and the part about these other boycotts, which is to say that I think the alternative to just saying, I'm not going to go to Target, I'm not going to go to Kohls, really, the alternative to just pulling yourself out of politics, one of the ways that you more fully engage in your larger communal life is telling good, beautiful stories, especially about sexual ethics. We have failed to tell good, beautiful stories about Christian sexual ethics. And if you are going to tell those stories, The Chosen is an example of like the way you'll have to do it is not by fully isolating yourself from people who disagree with you and doing it just in your tiny little community. And that's a cost that feels not, I don't even necessarily think it's a cost, but it's a choice that I think produces a lot of really good fruit. I know personally people who have watched The Chosen who are not Christians who have found something beautiful there and are intrigued by the message of Christianity because of what they saw there. I think we would do a lot better, not just in a big scale like making something like The Chosen, but even in our smaller families and communities of saying, yes, there might be a time where it's appropriate to abstain from something because I think it could harm me in some way or because I think it's a bad thing I should abstain from and make a message out of that. But that being the first thing we do instead of the first thing being, let's create something beautiful, let's do something, let's tell a different story. That's the impulse that I both feel like hurts us in our churches, like hurts us theologically, doesn't make better, more faithful Christians, but then doesn't give our communities good gifts. It just makes us look like we're not interested in having the story that we have to tell be out in the world with other stories and not actually believing that it would stand up against those other stories.
Skye, why do we care so much more about a pride flag on a T-shirt than whether or not the T-shirt was made in a sweatshop that exploited 150 Sri Lankans? Why is the ink on the T-shirt what we'll protest?
That's easy. Two words: consumerism and Marxism. That's all.
Okay. Consumerism and Marxism. Okay.
So
good night, everybody. Drive safe.
There you go. That should be self-evident to everybody.
We'll see you next time.
Let me start with the Marxism thing. I'm not a Marxist, but I think some of what Marx wrote is actually sort of insightful. And one of the core tenets of Marxism is that you alienate products from the story of their production or the origin of their production. So when we go shopping and we see a T-shirt on the rack at Target or Kohls or whatever, most of us, it never enters our brain, where did this shirt come from? Who made it? Were they paid fairly?
Came from Target.
We just assume that product magically appeared on the rack or on the shelf because it exists solely for our consumption. And so the alienation of a product from the origin of where it came from is a core tenet of Marxism, and that's prevalent throughout our culture. So that's explanation number one. But then explanation number two is the consumerism thing, which gets back to the branding I was talking about earlier, that in a consumer culture, the way you construct and display your identity is through the brands that you consume and display. So when we see a T-shirt with a pride flag, we don't care about where it came from because of Marxism. And then the pride flag becomes a way of signaling my identity or my anti-identity. Like, I am not going to buy that shirt because it displays an identity I don't agree with, or I will buy a shirt because it displays an identity I do agree with. So it's no longer a T-shirt. It's a communication of identity. And with identity comes all of that energy and anger or pride, or it's just loaded with all that. And so that's why these battles keep happening. And we don't care about the sweatshop the shirt may have come from. We just care about what I am saying about myself if I were to purchase and wear it. It's a very narcissistic way of thinking about everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't want anyone to have the opportunity to purchase that shirt and wear it. It's not just that, like, it's one thing if said people are forcing my baby to wear a pride flag. The government is making our babies wear pride flags, but it's not. No, Kohls had a onesie with a pride flag, and now I need to burn down Kohls.
Well, and I don't think it's just that someone's forcing my kid to wear a pride flag onesie. It's that when I walk through Kohls and I see that product, the fact that Kohls chose to put that there is a reflection of Kohls' identity. And I'm shopping at Kohls, which means I am only one step removed from this ungodly identity that I perceive. Oh. So it's that purity instinct. It's what did we say earlier? It's a purity death spiral, which I think would be a great name for like a Christian metal band.
Yeah.
But that's the That's the purity death spiral. Is I'm shopping at Kohls, and Kohls clearly is okay with this product. So therefore, in a weird way, I must be okay with that product, and I need to maintain my purity. I'm not going to gouge out my eye or cut off my hand. I'm going to boycott Kohls. That's a way of me maintaining my purity.
Fascinating.
Because their identity is tainted. I don't want my identity tainted.
Okay. For like the 10th time, I'm going to bring up that I just read Mark Noll's book on Civil War theology. And one interesting point that I think is relevant here is he looked at the writings of the European Catholic Church, the bishops and the Pope in Italy. What were they saying about the conflict in America leading up to the Civil War? And it was interesting because many of them would talk about the racism. Many European Protestants would talk about the racism that they saw in slavery. But the Catholic Church in Europe would talk about the economics that they saw. And the point that they raise is you have both sides in this conflict in America saying the Bible is on their side. The Bible clearly does not forbid slavery. The Bible clearly allows us to have this practice. And it was the Catholic Church in Europe that was saying, this is how completely unfettered capitalism affects theology, in that their economics are so important to them in America. Every man for himself, complete independence of economic pursuit, that it now distorts theology to every theologian for himself. And they're warping their theology to defend their economic system.
Yeah.
I've been saying this for 12 years on this show, that our economics drives our theology.
Oh,
absolutely.
Well, the Pope beat you to it by roughly 170 years.
Good news you can use to chase away those pesky blues. Wish you could, I think you should try News of the Good.
Hey everyone, it's Skye, back for a little bit of News of the Good. I'm joined by Lanray Williams Ayadun from World Relief. Good to see you again. Welcome back to the Holy Post.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
So a lot of folks every day, they turn on the news and they see the headlines coming out of Ukraine and the devastation that's happened there since the Russian invasion over a year ago now. Bombings in Kyiv, other parts of the country being absolutely devastated, and millions of people have fled the country to neighboring countries, especially Poland. Give us an update on what's going on with the refugees, how many people have left, and what's sort of the humanitarian disaster and crisis that we're facing because of this invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, a year and a half on, when the war first started, in the first 12 days of the onslaught of violence, about 2 million people became instantly refugees in just 12 days. And in the year and a half since, we've seen 13.5 million people that have been displaced outside of Ukraine. And that's not counting the 5.4 million people that are displaced inside of Ukraine. So this is a massive human displacement crisis. And as you know, and as you've heard in the news, with very little hope of there being a resolution to this swiftly.
Right.
So we're talking about almost 18 million people that are in need of humanitarian assistance currently.
So again, often in the news, we hear about Ukraine needing military aid. They need weapons. They need fighter planes. They need Patriot missiles to shoot down the incoming missiles from Russia. But we don't hear as much about the humanitarian aid. So this is News of the Good. In this horrible situation, can you share with us some news about what's happening on the ground that should give us hope?
Absolutely. I think in the very first days, I'm talking the first week of when this war began, World Relief began to get calls and emails from church partners that had been in Ukraine and were deciding to stay to respond as people were fleeing and trying to flee across borders. Church partners, these were small churches, sometimes networks of churches that had an individual pastor, a pastor's family that said, at least we have a building and it's still standing. We can provide shelter. We can provide food for whatever it is that we have. We can share that, and we can put blankets up. And so churches did. They really became the kind of shelter system for people that were looking to cross borders. Churches were the ones that opened their doors and provided cots for people to sleep on. They were sourcing food from the markets when they had it available, handing out water, really coming alongside these families. And mostly what we were seeing were families that were separated. It was the women and the children that were having to make the long walk outside of where the shelling or the fighting was most urgent, and then trying to move across borders or to safer parts of the country. And so it was those church partners and those pastors that opened their doors and started providing support. And they quickly started to come to organizations like World Relief and say, this is more than we've ever done before. We are a small church. We don't know how to provide humanitarian assistance. What can you do with us? And so we started to walk alongside these Christian organizations, these churches, to look at how can we mount something that is more comprehensive, that helps to provide the kind of support that these families are needing in the immediate term, when the war first started, and then now longer term, to try to help do what we can in order to rebuild parts of Ukraine that have been safe for people to return to, and supporting families to try to build some sense of hope for the future as well.
So I'm thinking back a couple of years when there was the civil war going on in Syria, and there was a refugee crisis of millions of people leaving Syria, heading into Turkey, and from Turkey going into other parts of Europe. And there were some wonderful stories of churches opening up and people opening their homes and caring for those refugees. But there were also some pretty terrible stories of racism and resistance and not wanting these foreigners to come in and take over jobs or land or resources. The countries that are bordering Ukraine right now, I'm thinking especially of Poland, how have churches there responded? It's one thing for Ukrainian churches to say, we're going to open up and care for our neighbors who are displaced by this and our own countrymen and citizens and stuff. What about people across the border for whom these are foreigners who are coming into their land? How are the churches there responding?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, from our vantage point at World Relief, it's been really beautiful to see churches that have opened their doors and have done the same thing, essentially said, this is a crisis of humans, of primarily women, children, the elderly, sometimes people with disabilities as they're able to cross the border. And we as the body of Christ need to respond. There's this beautiful example that we've been following with some of our partners. So this is a Slovakian organization that has partnered inside of Ukraine with, it's a Greek Orthodox church, a Bible church that's evangelical, a bunch of Catholic organization that came together and essentially said, how do we provide support? And they welcomed this Slovakian organization that had been working with refugees that came across the border there. Inside of Ukraine, what is it that we can do? And they really said the big need that we have in the city of Irpin, which is just outside of Kyiv, the big need that we have here is shelter. Essentially, 71% of the homes in the city had been destroyed. And yet folks were starting to come back and trying to figure out, how do we live in this place? And so this committee came together of these kind of unlikely partners. One of them is a seminary, kind of providing humanitarian response is not what they would normally be doing in their regular course of business, but they all came together and said, okay, the Slovakian organization has got some technical expertise here. World Relief can support. We have outreach with churches in different areas. We know the communities and we can come together. And they decided what we're going to do is contract with a construction company and build modular kind of mobile homes. These homes would be built kind of in a different location and then essentially like airlifted and dropped into the city of Irpin. And that's what we did. And we started to provide this project for people, particularly as the winter was starting to come in Ukraine. And it's a beautiful picture of, again, unlikely partners that came together and said, there's a real need. And the folks that are needing the support are women, their children, their elderly families that need the support. And we can do something about that.
It reminds me years ago, I think it was before Congress that Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, was being asked, what do you tell kids when there's these tragedies and disasters? And he said, help the kids always to look for the helpers. There's always people who are helping. And it's so encouraging to hear, not just that churches and church leaders stayed in those communities that desperately needed them, but then they were willing to transcend boundaries and partner across ecclesiastical differences, in different institutional differences, different national differences, to come up with a practical need, like creating mobile homes and airdropping them into a place that really need them. In a remaining minute or two, do you have any other stories of hope, news of the good coming out of Ukraine right now from what you guys have been researching?
Yeah, I think you were talking about humanitarian needs, like what does that actually look like? And so we've provided over 343,000 people with humanitarian support inside of Ukraine from our response. And so this has been, some things as simple as a couple of days of shelter while people are trying to move from place to place. We've really partnered with churches to provide psychosocial support, like mental health support. How do we sit with people that are dealing with the traumas that they've experienced? We're really excited that we've been doing art therapy with kids. And so allowing them to play and to use color and art to kind of express the things that are going on with them, and to look at how we can help to strengthen families again, and doing family reunifications as well for those families that, like I said, have been separated. How do we bring them back together and give them a home and some hope for what the future could look like as we continue to partner with the local community to look at rebuilding a strong Ukraine.
Yeah, like we said at the beginning, on the news footage, we see the physical destruction of Ukraine that's happened over the last year and a half, but you can't photograph the emotional, psychological, familial destruction that's happened. And that's going to take decades, if not generations, to repair. All the more reason why we need to have resources and people, God's people on the ground to do those things, to sit with those children, to hear those stories, to create art and music and restore beauty again in this devastating place. So, Lannery, thank you for sharing a bit of what's going on, some of the good news that's coming out of the devastation in Ukraine. We appreciate it. Thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you. These are a few glimpses of the things that are happening. There are many more. If we had time, could talk about a lot more things, but yes, there's a lot of need, and yet the helpers are there, and it's exciting to be partnering with them for sure. Thank you.
Good news you can use to chase away those pesky blues. Wish you could, I think you should try News of the Good.
So, okay, we have one other story I wanted to cover, which is kind of related, the topic of religious freedom. And this is written by a rabbi named Brad Hirschfield. It was in Religion News Service. Florida fifth grade teacher Jenna Barbie is under a state investigation for showing her class a Disney movie because the film features a gay character. And watching that in the classroom currently violates state law. The parent who lodged the complaint, and this is where our rabbi friend Brad dives into it, the parent who lodged the complaint that launched the investigation against Barbie is Shannon Rodriguez, who happened to be an elected member of the Hernando County School District Board. She justified her inquiry by asserting that, quote, God put me here. I have to do this inquiry because God put me on this board for a reason. And Hirschfield says this is where things get problematic, regardless of one's view on the specific issue. With those 5 words, that is where Rodriguez failed as a public official. In the United States of America, we are not led by prophets, but by elected officials whose job is to follow, make, and educate the law of the land, not the laws of Scripture or the Word of God. There is a world of difference between what one believes on the one hand and using that belief as a prophetic calling to mess with other people's lives. As a parent, Rodriguez is free to complain about her kid's teacher. As a school board member, she is free and perhaps even obligated to jump into the issue, no matter how much some of us disagree with the side onto which she has jumped. As an elected official, however, she is also obligated to stay clear of acting as prophet, declaring with certainty God's plan for her or for anyone else. And then he goes on to say, this illustrates the evolution over the past 35 years in this country of what it means to fight for freedom of religion. Going back to Thomas Jefferson's defense of Baptist faith and practice, freedom of religion in America has been a fight for religious minorities' right to be present, to practice their respective faith freely and fully. The Florida case is the latest example of how that has changed. Religious freedom and faith-based politics, as practiced by Rodriguez and those who support her based on divine providence, has shifted to a fight not to secure their own free expression, but to secure the absences of those with whom they disagree. We must keep prophecy and public leadership as far away from one another as possible, and always distinguish between the fight for greater presence, which is sacred, and the fight to make others absent, which is almost always the opposite. Interesting. Agree, disagree, discuss amongst yourselves.
I don't know. Caitlin, you want to go first?
I thought this was so interesting that the criticism that he leveled was phrased in the context of her being prophetic or her making a prophetic stance. I haven't looked much into this case. It seems to me like she did launched an investigation, used her role appropriately. It's just that the decision she made about what to launch an investigation about, she couched in terms of God put me in this position. And I do think it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to hear the concept of prophetic be critiqued in this context when it's often more progressive Christians saying we need to be prophetic in the public sphere. We need to, speak truth to power. We need to fight injustice. And I do think this is a good description of how whether or not you think something is prophetic or is appropriately prophetic is partially dependent on your judgment about if the thing itself is good or not. There's a really interesting book written by a political theorist named Kathleen Kavanagh about prophecy in public debate and kind of public discourse. And she distinguishes between times when people think being prophetic is appropriate, not just in a religious sense, but in a secular sense as well. And what she means by that is I don't have to compromise with you. This is just a moral issue. It's clear cut. This is the person who says, I won't sign the marriage certificate, but it's also the person who says, I'm tying myself to this tree and you can't cut this tree down. Or that's like the prophetic moment in public life. And she contrasts that with deliberative discourse that might say, I have religious reasons or deeply held convictions or a variety of reasons for why I think this is important. And I think it's morally important, but I don't think it rises to the level where I need to chain myself to a tree or sit outside of an abortion clinic or something like that. And I think it would be healthier for us in our general political and public lives to spend more time recognizing that both of those do have a role. None of us think there's no role for the prophetic. There are things that we think rise to the level of requiring someone to do things that are kind of outside the norm of deliberative discourse, but that we would do better to spend time evaluating where the line should be drawn between those two things. That's really where we disagree, not just what side of it we're on, but what kinds of things rise to that level. And in this case, I think most people who are being critical of her either just really disagree with the choice that she's made about this movie, or they might be people who even say, yeah, I don't know that I love that movie for my class or whatever, but I don't think the way that you did this or the language you used is appropriate for this kind of context. And I think you could have a variety of perspectives on that, but I also think we would do better if we had more conversation about not everything rises to the level of requiring a prophetic critique. Some things do, and our ability to navigate those would be greatly increased if we would have more conversations about why we draw the line, where we draw the line. Because if this was someone saying, hey, it wasn't about this movie where we have great disagreements about sexual ethics. What if it was about something that was really, truly, more of us agreed was evil or harmful to that class? We would say, yeah, use your position for whatever it is. Be the prophet. If there's someone abusing a child in the class, do whatever you have to do. We just should recognize that part of the conflict here is not just about, yes, this very contested issue of sexual ethics and what's appropriate for children in schools and kind of parents' involvement in things. It's also a debate about what rises to the level of prophetic critique, and I think we should spend more time working that out.
I agree. Regarding this article, Phil, I think there's one area where I agree with him and there's one where I disagree. So where I agree is I think he's generally correct that the fights around religious liberty have changed in the last 30 years from a desire for a religious minority to have full presence in the culture. The rights of Catholics or Jews or Muslims or Hindus or whoever, or in the early days of the Republic, it was the rights of Protestants and Baptists to be able to access the full public square. It's gone from that to arguments about forcing people out, or religious groups saying we don't want to have to see that group, or we don't want to have to serve this group. It's an exclusionary posture. So I think he's correct on that shift. Where I disagree with him is I don't think it's wrong for a public elected official to say things that are religious or to express religious motivation for their political stances. A lot of times I'm going to think those motivations are stupid, but they have every right to have them and express them. So, for example, if somebody gets up and says, they're a public official and they say, the way I read the Bible, races should be separated, and therefore I am going to fight in my public office for segregation. I think they have every right to say that. In fact, I'm kind of grateful that they say that, because now I know what they believe and where they stand. Where it goes too far is when you say, because I hold this religious conviction, I'm going to force the law to abide by my religious conviction rather than persuading my fellow citizens of my rightness based on a secular argument. So in this case, this official, this woman, said that her religious convictions make her believe that this movie is ungodly and wrong and a school shouldn't show it. Okay, you're free to express that. But what she failed to do was give a secular argument for why other citizens who don't share her religious convictions should not want this movie shown in a public school. That's where you have to make a pluralistic argument based on something other than just your religious conviction. So I don't think it's wrong for any public official to express the source of their motivation. That's fine. They have every right to do that. But you can't impose that upon the rest of your citizens.
Yeah.
Who don't share that conviction.
Yeah, and don't you think there's a difference between saying I am taking a prophetic role here, I'm speaking truth to power in that sense of being prophetic, versus I am speaking on behalf of my deity. I am here in Congress speaking on behalf of my deity. Isn't that a slightly different characterization of prophetic?
Yeah, but it's not wrong. It's not illegal. It's not un-American. You can
illegal.
Do it.
Okay.
You might be, but I that's where I thought the article went a little bit too far. Like, no, It's not wrong for her to do that. You can disagree with it, but it's not un-American or wrong.
And she didn't even, to my reading, say God has said that this is wrong. She just said God put me in this kind of position. And he affirmed in the article, said, I think it's good. I agree with you that God has providence over things and we should think about that. But this is a good example of a lot of other things too, where this is the central prophetic conflict in Scripture too. Is like who actually speaks for God, who actually knows what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And to Skye's point, I would rather live in a country where my next door Muslim neighbors can say, well, we think God is saying this when it comes to this policy, and I can say I think God has said this, and we can have that conversation and both try and give reasons, as Skye said, that help each other kind of come to the same place if we can, than one where we just can't say that at all. And there's even, I think Elizabeth Brunick has written before about how when we think that when there's too much emphasis on translating our religious beliefs into something palatable to other people, what we actually often end up doing is just deceiving people. And we have enough deception in politics, so we should have less of it and be honest about when I'm advocating for greater protections for refugees in the U.S. or allowing, safer immigration processes, easier immigration processes. I don't want to lie to you and say I'm doing that just because I've rationally come to the conclusion that's good. I'm doing it because I think the Old Testament says that God judges nations by how they treat foreigners. And I should be honest about the fact that that's why I've come to that conclusion.
Right. And if your next door neighbor doesn't share that conviction in the Old Testament, you can say, okay, well, here's other reasons why we should be compassionate to immigrants and build an argument for them. So you build consensus, you have conversation, you dialogue, you compromise. That's what a pluralistic society is supposed to do. But when you just come in and say, thus saith the Lord, and everyone who disagrees with me can, there's the door, love it or leave it kind of attitude, that's not what a pluralistic society should do.
Okay, so Rabbi Hirschfield, we kind of agree with you and we kind of not, but we liked your
like
article.
most things.
Okay,
yeah,
I did. Yes.
Okay, so we got to wrap it up. Should I boycott The Chosen because they allowed a pride flag to be off to the side in a set, Or should I boycott the Daily Wire for attacking the Chosen? Or should I boycott the Daily Wire for the CEO attacking the Daily Wire, for the Daily Wire attacking the Chosen? Who should I boycott and for why? Twitter.
Just probably, I don't know. I think it'd be good for all of us.
Boycott Twitter.
I've been off Twitter for like the last week or so.
You would hear less about these other
just
boycotts if we all just boycotted Twitter.
Strangely quiet. I know. Then what would we talk about? What would we talk about? I don't even know what we talk about. Okay. I'm going to go get my pirate ship and go sail around my neighborhood and pull down some signs that I find illegal. And then turn them into an art exhibit and see if I can make some money on it. Here's $10. Want to see the illegal signs that I stole. My stolen illegal signs. Oh, boy. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. There's new stuff every single week there.
Hey,
what?
It's called Holy Post Plus.
Oh, we changed the name. We got the Patreon company to officially change their name to Holy Post Plus. Thank you for subscribing to Holy Post Plus, where you can get lots of exclusive content from Caitlin, from Skye, from Christian, not from Phil. I'm just the host. I don't have anything else to say.
There's some bonus stuff up there from you, and you're going to be helping us produce some brand new stuff. I'm excited to announce that soon, this new series we're going to be doing for our Holy Post Plus supporters.
There's a new series coming for Holy Post Plus supporters.
Yeah, It's very exciting. It involves our pundits.
It's very exciting. It involves the pundits. Very exciting. They're not pirates. They're pundits. They're atheist street pundits.
We should consider pirates.
We should have called... Seriously, we should have called them Holy Post Pirates.
Arg! And they all have to start everything they say with an arg. Give us an arg. And now you're a pirate. Arg. Okay. Thanks, everybody. And we got a great guest. You're going to love it. And we'll see you next week. Bye. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Miracle Made. Hey, having a better day tomorrow can start with getting a better night's sleep tonight, and Miracle Made bed sheets can help do that. How? Miracle Made sheets use NASA-inspired technology to help regulate temperature while you sleep. Plus, they're infused with silver to fight bacteria and keep your sheets cleaner longer. Go to trymiracle.com/holypost to try Miracle Made sheets today. And with Mother's and Father's Day right around the corner, this is the perfect way to give someone you love the gift of better and more luxurious sleep. Save over 40% and be sure to use our promo code HOLYPOST at checkout to save even more and get 3 free towels. With a 30-day money-back guarantee, if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/holypost and use the code HOLYPOST to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/holypost. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. Today's episode is sponsored in part by the Wheaton College Graduate School. Are you a lay leader in your church longing for more training to help you help others? Are you someone with a passion to work with hurting people and people on the margins of society through counseling? Would you love to dive deeper into a particular area, the Old or New Testament, with focused training from globally recognized scholars? You can equip yourself for service through one of the many programs at the Wheaton College Graduate School. The Graduate School at Wheaton College intentionally fosters an environment of academic inquiry and diversity of thought, where different perspectives are appreciated and insightful conversations happen every day. And many of the programs are now offered in a flexible learning format, so you don't need to leave your work or ministry commitments to earn a graduate degree. So what are you waiting for? Enhance your faith and your work with a program of study at Wheaton. Go to wheaton.edu/holypost to explore more than 20 different master's, doctoral, and certificate programs. That's wheaton.edu/holypost.
In case you haven't noticed, humility is in short supply these days. No doubt social media and smartphones haven't helped, as they've made us all more self-absorbed. And the age of self-deprecating Hollywood stars, musicians, athletes, and politicians feels like ancient history. But as my guest Richard Foster points out in his new book, humility has always been upheld as a virtue by the church, at least until recently. The rise of mega ministries, celebrity pastors, and a desire to change the world for Jesus has resulted in humility being increasingly seen as a barrier to God's mission rather than clear evidence of his power. Foster's new book is called Learning Humility: A Year of Searching for a Vanishing Virtue. Richard Foster is the founder of Renovare. He's written extensively about Christian spiritual formation, including a number of modern classics like Streams of Living Water, Prayer, and Celebration of Discipline, which has sold over 2 million copies. And I'm also joined today by Brenda Quinn, a pastor of spiritual formation in Denver who assisted Richard Foster with the book. She's particularly focused on what it looks like to cultivate humility at the congregational and community level. Here's my conversation with Richard Foster and Brenda Quinn. Richard Foster and Brenda Quinn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us. It's a delight.
So it isn't often that I get a book across my desk about humility. It's not exactly a popular topic, although it's not the first. I will say that. It's not the first. Richard, in the book, you trace the long, very rich history of humility as sort of a foundational Christian virtue. And you cite a lot of Christian writers and non-Christian sources about the importance of this thing. And in the very subtitle of the book, you talk about how it's a vanishing virtue. So let me begin for both of you with this question. Why, given that history, is humility vanishing as a virtue in our culture?
Isn't that an interesting fact? I mean, when we look at it, that was one of the things really early on. I kept asking myself, why has it been such a prominent virtue all through Christian history until our own time, when somehow the tradition got cut off? And so that's what led me to just see what I could learn about it. And of course, the press of our culture moves in a totally opposite direction. And so I just wanted to give a run at it and see if we can counter that a little bit. Because coming in touch with Jesus, oh my, I mean, there is humility all over the place. It's plastered all over. So we want to see it have a revival. How about that?
Yeah, as you stated throughout the book, it is such an elevated virtue. And it seems like it's gone from being elevated to being ignored to now it's even being shunned. So, Brenda, you're leading a local congregation. Just in your daily engagement, pastoral engagement with your people, how are you seeing them being shaped by the culture in a way that's antithetical to humility?
Oh, I think I see the whole gamut, in the church, because I do think there are still a lot of people out there that are humble, that read their Bibles and they're being shaped by Christ. But I think that, even all of our Christians out there, we live in the world. We're, having careers in the world, being influenced by leadership principles and models that are out there in the media, in every type, every area of our society. And I think it's just so easy to be so influenced by the leaders out there and the ways that they are pursuing life and telling us what we should strive for and how we should develop ourselves as leaders and how we should seek, the best of who we are. And so much, there's such a focus on the self really these days. And I think we can get, even as Christians, even as followers of Jesus, we can get pulled into that. And often it's for the right reasons. We're doing it to try and help the world. But if we're not careful, we start going about it in the wrong ways, and it causes a lot of problems.
Brenda, Brenda is...
Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
Brenda is so right that there are people that would exhibit this virtue, but in the dominant culture, it's not thought of as a good thing, often as a bad thing. But there are people, this is what I call it a vanishing virtue. The publishers wanted me to call it a lost virtue. And I said, no, it's not totally lost, but it is disappearing in our day. And that's one of the reasons for thinking about it. And like you say, it's not a topic that, you find tons of books about.
Yeah, when publishers are looking for books that are going to sell a lot or get on the bestseller list, humility is not the topic they go for. Speaking of examples, that there are still examples of this in the world, and on page 68, you write about Dr. Paul Brand, a close friend of Philip Yancey's that he wrote numerous books with and about. And Philip's been on the show before. I've talked to him about Dr. Brand. I know you've obviously talked to him at length because you incorporate it into your book. Dr. Brand was both very successful in his work as a physician and even celebrated by many different sectors, but incredibly humble at the same time. What do you think is required for somebody to both be actively engaged in important work in the world and maintain that sense of humility at the same time? They seem opposed to one another, but here they were together in one person.
Absolutely.
What does that require?
It requires, first, teachability. Humility and teachability come very close to one another, because if I'm not teachable, then how can humility develop in my life? Arrogance, narcissism, this self-focused, as Brenda said, that we see so often. It's learning to get away from that. The first thing is we learn to know ourselves, as Aristotle taught us. And that simple knowledge really, when you think of humility, humilitas, the earth, being close to the earth, think of humus. We don't exalt ourselves beyond what is appropriate, and we don't degrade ourselves beyond what's appropriate. We come to know ourselves. So that's the first thing. And then the teachability that I need to grow. Like one person wrote me just yesterday that he was insanely arrogant. Now, this was a person with a high IQ and all of that, and that seemed to characterize, he felt, himself, and that he needed to learn a new way.
So self-awareness being the prerequisite of all of this. And what comes out so clearly in your book is the amount of time you spent alone contemplating these ideas. I mean, it's a journey of a year through your writings and your self-reflections. And that seems to be in short supply these days. People don't know how to practice solitude and self-reflection.
That's exactly
So I guess we shouldn't be that surprised that humility doesn't come out of that. Brenda, a question for you. In the book I cited on page 52, Richard writes about the scene where the disciples are arguing with one another about who would be the greatest. And Jesus responds by putting a child in the midst of their presence and says, "You must become like this child." What should the role of children be in our church communities? And how can their participation with us model and cultivate humility among communities of believers?
Oh, that's such a great question. Great topic. Well, I love that story. I think about that story a lot in the Bible because isn't that a classic story about, them quarreling about who's going to be the greatest and worrying and really, thinking about that and talking to Jesus. And I mean, that reflects our society today, just those questions and those pursuits for ourselves. And I really appreciate you bringing into the discussion children, because children are such an important part of our church communities. And I find I do a lot with our children in our church, and I find that oftentimes one of the last places people want to volunteer is with the children. And I get really frustrated because it's so important. That time with the kids is so important in the shaping that we're doing. We were just talking about this subject a couple weeks ago on one of our podcasts, and we were talking about how kids are just that childlike purity. They haven't quite been spoiled by the world yet, and so that's such an important aspect of what Jesus is talking about when he says that we need to be childlike. But one of the other things that I think that we sometimes forget about kids is that kids really have a heart of love for Jesus. Kids have a strong love for him. And it's a pure love for him. And children, it doesn't take much to teach a child about Jesus, and they start loving him very quickly. And they give their whole hearts to him. And I do think that that's another aspect of what Jesus was bringing out in that discussion, that the older we get, the more we get focused on ourselves and making our own way in life. I think correspondingly, the less hot our love is for Jesus, the less full and the less our hearts belong to him. Whereas with kids, they give it all and they love him. And I think that's a big part of being childlike.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because it seems like, especially in the Protestant tradition, where so much of our assumption is that the way we love God is simply through our theological retention of knowledge, that a young child isn't cognitively capable of, therefore they must not be really able to love God. And that gets dismantled when you get out of that Western post-Enlightenment kind of tradition and recognize the simplicity of a heart turned toward him. And it does make me worry that in so many of our church structures, we've removed children. We've isolated them. We've taken them out of the normal flow of the community because they're seen as deficient in their ability. Therefore, they would impede us adults from the important work of learning and teaching and things like that. It felt to me, you didn't talk about children a lot in this book, but that was one of my big takeaways as I read it, is you did talk about service and the simplicity of things. We'll talk about nature in a little bit, but it felt like if we integrated children more into the life of our community, it would just slow us all down in a good way, in a healthy way.
Let me tell you just
something I'm wrestling with.
A little story in a church I pastored in the Northwest about a little fella named Davy. Davy was about 5 years old. He had Down syndrome. I remember spending all night long with Davy's mom and dad in the hospital to see whether or not Davy would live or die. Another time all day long. Davy had tubes coming out of his head to drain fluid, and he was in that hospital about 8 months. Now, hospital visitation was one of the things I did. And so over that 8-month period, there was a kind of friendship with Davy that was like steel. Davy wasn't expected to live long. As it turned out, he lived into his 20s. He actually outlived his mother, who died. But I remember the first time Davy got out of the hospital, came to the church, and we were it was after a service, we were down in the basement, maybe, 200, 300 people. And as I saw Davy come down the stairs, it's just like we connected, and he made a beeline straight toward me. And he couldn't pronounce my name. He called me Mithaphatha. But no children's church for Davy. He stayed in that worship service, perched up on that pew. I mean, I'd preach my heart out because Davy was there listening. And it was a great friendship that we did. And you see, Davy with Down syndrome, he had what Brenda talked about, a sheer love of Jesus that just seemed to, bypass, in a sense, all of our theological jargon. He just wanted to love God and love Jesus and live his life as best he could. He was great. I learned a lot from Davy. Mm-hmm.
What a beautiful story. And I know many of us have examples of people like a Davy in our life, whether someone with Downs or some other gift for the church that reveals the reality of Christ to us in a sometimes unexpected way. Related to that, Richard, you talk in the book about one of the common mistakes we make around humility and other virtues, I suppose, is that we think we can attain them directly. But you talk about the principle of indirection. So a lot of us would think, well, I'm not going to learn something profoundly important directly from a kid with Down syndrome or children in general or whatever, but they have an indirect way of guiding us to the truth of God. Explain what you mean by this principle of indirection, and what does that look like in either our individual lives or collectively as churches and congregations?
When we look about the development of the moral life, a life, as Paul put it, of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit, there are particular aspects of that absolutely do not respond to direct action. And humility is one of those. You know, I've doubled my humility this year. I mean, it doesn't work that way. So we come at it indirectly. And service is one of the easiest ways to understand that. We begin to pay attention to another human being and serve them. And that indirectly will bring a virtue, a grace into my life, an increase in humility. And it's so simple, see. People, we screw down the willpower. I call it the white knuckle club. We're going to come into God. Well, with humility, we don't come at it directly, but by indirection. We learn to value human beings. And when we do that, we find that a grace of humility begins to be built in us. And we're as surprised as anybody else. Remember how the disciples, Jesus said, let your light so shine before everybody that they'll see your good works and glorify who? Glorify God. Now, why isn't it they get glorified? No. We know that we've done nothing more than to receive a gift. And we learn to live that way. And so then the grace of God slips in and can take over the personality. In time, sometimes quite a bit of time. Remember Moses, it took him 40 years to learn to do the work of God in the power of the Spirit.
Brenda, as you think about that indirectness and your vocation in ministry, I was a local church pastor for some years and then worked at Christianity Today for Leadership Journal, the magazine for pastors, and I felt like I was inundated with books and articles and resources telling me directly how to do things as a pastor, how to bring change or how to bring growth or how to do this. As a minister yourself, how do you avoid falling into that trap of direct action, thinking that you can pull the right levers and get outcomes? Is there something in your own life that's helped you avoid that prideful way of ministering rather than the more humble way, the indirect way?
I think for me, my husband and I have been involved in many churches over the course of many years, and we've been in churches that have failed and that have closed, and it's just been heartbreaking and super hard and emotional, and we've, poured ourselves in, and there's been kind of no rhyme or reason to it. And I think the thing that has taught me is that God is the head of the church and the Holy Spirit is the leader. And we can take advantage of all the human wisdom in the world. And sometimes that's helpful. But the bottom line is, we're his servants. And for whatever reason, he's called us to the position we may be in at the moment. It's all up to him. It's not up to us. And so I think just soaking in him and seeking his direction every day and seeking to serve, being more concerned about serving maybe than about leading, letting servanthood be the way we lead, and leaving the outcomes to him, I think is, I think maybe it's opening our hands, serving with open hands, not in a sense that we have control and that we're going to shape the way things turn out or the success of our ministry.
Yeah, that's hard to do these days because it seems like so much of the ministry culture in America has been shaped by like corporate values where we have our 3-year plan, our 5-year plan, our goal, our trajectory, our outcomes, our metrics. And that is sort of the antithesis of the open-handed servant approach rather than leadership approach that you're describing. Richard, I'm curious about this in your book. And I love this, you draw from so many other sources, contemporary, ancient, from within the church, beyond the church. One of the traditions you draw a lot from is the monastic tradition, and you note that both Saint Benedict and Bernard of Clairvaux had this very negative attitude about humor and laughter as it relates to humility.
Yes.
That caught me because you probably don't know anything about the podcast that you're currently on, but we do have a lot of fun on this show and some silliness that happens and things. And I was encouraged to hear and read in your book that you sort of disagreed with them about that.
Yes.
In fact, at one point in the book, you said, and this is a quote, "Humble folk laugh a lot." So let me ask you, what is the role of humor in the Christian life, and how can it be utilized for humility?
One of the great dangers of religious folk is that they can become stuffy bores. And one of the freedoms that humility gives us is the gift of laughter, because we don't have to protect our turf. We don't have to make sure that everybody thinks we're wonderful. We're just free from any need, to create an image that is so admired. See, humility undercuts all of that. And so we're free to laugh at ourselves when we make silly mistakes. We're free to just enjoy humor. Sometimes when I used to teach college kids about this, some of them would get so intense that I would just have to say, "No, just cut out all this religious stuff and, I don't know, go watch a baseball game or play a game or something. Learn to play like a child, and that will help."
Yeah, we do have a way of taking ourselves way too seriously. That's for sure.
Yes.
Another theme that's in the book, and I hadn't expected, this book, to be honest with you, it came, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, and it was sat on my shelf with a bunch of other books until I had to begin to prepare for this interview. So then I finally read it, and I wasn't expecting the whole book to be organized around the Lakota lunar calendar. And you draw a lot from Lakota and other native cultures in really amazing and beautiful ways. And you note early in the book, and you said this earlier in the interview, that the word humility means earthly or close to the ground or the dirt. And there's so much nature throughout this book, your own reflections as you look out your window and a number of other things. What is the role of nature and the natural world and creation in teaching us humility?
The great devotional writers tell us that we're to read 2 books, the Bible and the book of nature. And often we've forgotten the second one. And so I've tried to give some attention to that and to learn from the world in which we live. And there's a reflection of the life of God in all of these things. Now, I don't mean any kind of identification with nature as divine or none of that, but just that this is the created order. And God invites me to learn from creation. Just, I don't know. And that the Lakota calendar just felt like a nice way to think about that. So I decided, when I made the decision that this was going to work like a journal, I didn't want to use the Latin Gregorian months of January, February, March. And that's why I gravitated toward the Lakota calendar, because of its deep connection to the earth. The moon when the ducks come back, I love that.
Yeah, I love the titles. The chapter titles are beautiful, but it just fits thematically so nicely with that. When you place yourself within the larger cosmos, you feel small, you're humbled. And that's what that calendar kind of brings back in front of us. Brenda, you're in Denver, and I know there's a lot of our audience that are more urban or suburban areas. As you minister to people in that context, how do you try to connect them? I mean, Denver's still nice. You got mountains in the background at least, but like, how do you help people engage appropriately with nature in a more urban or suburban context when we seem so isolated and distant from that?
Yeah, I think, like Richard said, so many of the devotional masters, as well as, Romans chapter 1 talks about God revealing himself
right
through in the world, in creation. And I think wherever we live, we have it easy in Colorado because we can just look to the west and we can see the mountains. Well, if you're in the Denver area, Front Range area, but wherever you live, you've got some kind of nature around you. And I don't think it takes mountains or any kind of spectacular photographic scenery to be able to enjoy, there's beauty in every kind of landscape. And we've all got the outdoors around us in some way. Even if we're right in the middle of an urban city, I think we can still go to parks and places. I think it's so important for us to get out of the indoors and breathe the fresh air. And no matter where we are, we experience God there when we're in that place. And I love this book and the fact that he brought in the Lakota people who were, all the Native Americans were so close to the earth. Because as Richard uses so many of their quotes about, humility being the very first virtue of the Lakota people, that's not coincidence. That's a revelation from God. And I believe that came through nature, through their connection to nature. They learned so much about the Creator God because they were so tied to his world. And that's biblical, that fits with Romans chapter 1. They learned a lot about God and about his character and the things that are important for people because they were connected to his earth. And that's the same for us. We need to keep that connection.
Amen. Okay, last question. And this is one that I'm selfishly asking this because I don't know if this serves my audience, but it serves me. So I'm asking this question. At the very end of the book, Richard, you acknowledge a paradox or a contradiction. And here's the quote. You write, humility, a virtue that focuses on obscurity and hiddenness, and publishing, a business that stresses name recognition and a wide readership. That is I think you had a conversation with your son about writing this book, and he brought it out that this doesn't make sense. You're writing about humility, but you're publishing it, and those two things are in conflict with each other.
I know.
So what wisdom do you...
Go ahead.
What wisdom do you have for me or anyone else who's trying to follow the way of Jesus and yet is in a vocation that seems designed to cultivate the antithesis of humility?
I have very little wisdom. I just know that, if I had my druthers, Brenda is talking about the mountains here, I would go up into those mountains and disappear and be never heard from again. I'd go for that. But that hasn't been my lot. And there is a certain name recognition and all that comes with publishing. And so you have to live with that kind of tension. And writing a book like this is exactly that, because you do have to be in the public. And you live with that kind of tension that goes on. Yeah. So I say, good luck.
Well, Richard, I appreciate that your heart is to go up into the mountains and disappear, but my bookshelf is filled with the fruit of the fact that you didn't do that. Yes. Like your writings for 20, 25 years have impacted me. in my own life with God and my ministry to others. So I'm grateful that God hasn't called you to just go up to the mountains and disappear. But there is that tension of doing that good work you're called to, and the work you're called to, Brenda, in a congregational setting, and the work I may be called to. But how do we not allow those things to combat the calling to live humbly as well? Your well wishes are appreciated, but the book offers more than that, thankfully.
Skye, can I read a couple sentences from his book on that?
Absolutely. Go for it.
So I love this. He brings in Andrew Murray, who wrote his own book on humility many decades ago. And Andrew Murray says the first and most essential element of discipleship is humility. And then Richard goes on to say, he really pondered this and said, that threw me for a loop. I wouldn't have thought of humility as the first part of discipleship, the most important part. And he said, I now see that in discipleship to Christ, we need to train ourselves to fight the devil, defeating the pride-filled arrogance and raging narcissism that plagues modern culture. We need to learn the subtleties of pride that can seep into the innermost chambers of the heart, puffing up our ego. And I think that for many of us in these kinds of careers or callings that God has given to us, the tension that we're talking about here, really, it does come down to fighting against the devil in what we're doing. And that's a hard place. That feels like a hard place to be. And like Richard's saying, it would be a whole lot easier just to disappear into the hills and just not be part of that fight, just to step outside of it. But if we feel God's called us to where we are, then I think the other side to that is that God is faithful. And in that fight against the devil, that the devil would love to suck us into everything that the culture tells us we need to do and be. God is faithful. If our hearts are for him, and if we are disciplined in the way that we approach our calling and putting him first and keeping our eyes on him and not on ourselves, God will be faithful to guiding us in that maze that we have to walk through every day to try and stay free of pride taking hold of us and guiding what we do and allowing the Holy Spirit instead to be our guide.
And
wonderful word. What comes to mind when you talk about, go ahead, Richard.
I just want to say, let's be sure we look to Jesus, who is the divine paradigm for conjugating all the verbs of life. And we just soak ourselves, marinate in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that gives us a picture of how you can be a leader, how you can have, tremendous influence and still have a humble life. Jesus is our model.
Yeah, Brenda, you talked about fixing our eyes on Jesus and Richard going to the Gospels and using him as our model. And what comes to mind is Hebrews 12 talks about fixing our eyes on Jesus, but just before that, it also talks about the great cloud of witnesses that have gone before us, who have faithfully walked this road. And reading your book, I'm reminded of the wonderful examples throughout history, flawed examples, but wonderful examples like Benedict and Andrew Murray and C.S. Lewis and Richard Foster, of people who have wrestled with this issue and have provided us wisdom and guidance through your example and your works. So thank you for doing that and contributing to it. And this conversation, it is a vanishing virtue. And I really encourage everyone, pick up this book, Learning Humility, A Year of Searching for a Vanishing Virtue. It's a gentle and warm book that takes you through reflections on this really important quality that doesn't get enough attention anymore. So, Richard Foster, thank you so much for the book and all the stuff that you've contributed to my formation over the years. And Brenda, I know you've contributed to a lot of those resources as well. I didn't acknowledge that before, of how many of the books on my shelf that are also from you and that you've contributed to. But thank you for that and for employing this in a congregational setting. Appreciate it very much. Thank you for being with me.
Wonderful to be with you.
It's been a pleasure.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.